Hello, Packer fans, wherever you may be. It's time for another edition of the Pack Attack Cast. Today, we're going to take a far too early look at free agency and some of the targets the Packers could look at. Main sources of pain for me is the offensive line and multiple defensive positions that I think the Packers can really get some help with in free agency. So we're going to really dive down mainly on the offensive line and also looking at some players on defense that might be available in free agency that could be key signings for your Green Bay Packers as they head to the Super Bowl this year. Knock on wood. So let's get into some of the players that I think are going to be available and could be good fits for the Green Bay Packers. But first, I want to thank everybody for their continued support. We're almost up to 17,000 subscribers. We'd like to get that number closer to maybe 20,000 before our anniversary on March 10th. So we've got a little over a month to try to get to another 3,000 subs. If you can hit that sub button, we would really appreciate it. So let's take a look at some free agent targets for the Green Bay Packers. We're going to start on defensive line. I would argue while the corners were a problem at the end of the season in through the playoffs, the real source of the problem, or one of the major contributing sources of that problem, is actually the defensive line not getting effective pass rush or stopping the run towards the end of the season, which made things very challenging for the corners who are constantly trying to hold the opposition's wide receivers and tight ends for much longer than the NFL average, simply because we're not getting a pass rush. So what could we do on the defensive line to start out to improve that? So one of the players that I think has about a 75% chance of getting to free agency and would help the Packers, whether they're in a 3-4 or a 4-3. In fact, if they switch to a 3-4, this player would really be a very good signing for the Packers. And that would be DJ Reader of the Detroit Lions. He's going to be on the older side of things. He's going to be 31 at the start of the season. But if you look at most of the free agent defensive tackles that are going to be on the market, they're definitely on the older side. Now, DJ Reader is a proven run stuffer. I think he would be very effective in the short term. If you can get him for a one-year contract for $5 million or less, which I think is very viable, then DJ Reader might end up being a key contributor for the Green Bay Packers, especially in improving that run defense, which is really what DJ Reader does very well. I think you can actually get him around that price tag. So his market is probably going to be $4.5 million to $6 million. If you get him in that sweet spot, then I think he could be a great contributor. And the Detroit Lions have more salary cap problems than the Packers, just as an example. So I think it is more likely that DJ Reader hits the free agent market this year. So we're going to watch that very carefully. And I think he could be a good, low risk, high reward, relatively cheap signing for the Packers. This one that's coming up, Calais Campbell, currently of the Arizona Cardinals. He's 39 years old. He's the ageless wonder, and he still had a PFF grade of over 80 this past year. He's very good at getting quarterback pressures for his age and size, and he's also very good against the run. So Calais Campbell would be an interesting signing opportunity for the Packers. Now, he is 39 years old. I don't think he's going to go back to the Cardinals. And in fact, it's probably about a 75 to 80% chance that Campbell ends up retiring this year. Now, he might say, hey, I could go to the Green Bay Packers on a really cheap deal and be a part-time player and probably get a good chance at a championship. So that's something that Campbell might consider. But I think Calais Campbell is probably going to look at how free agency starts early and see if he gets some nibbles. And if so, he might come back for another year. But I do think it's probably more likely than not that Campbell will end up retiring. But if he is available, he's the type of player you could probably sign for $3 or $4 million, be a part-time player on your defensive line, and get some really good return for that investment. So definitely keep him in mind. Another friend that we've looked at many times in the past is the ultimate mercenary on the defensive line, and that's Jadeveon Clowney. He's traveled year after year. He's the nomad of the NFL for defensive lines, but he still has over an 80 PFF grade. He was very effective in the pressure rate with the Cowboys. He had a 19.1 pressure rate, and only Micah Parsons and Will Anderson Jr. had a higher pressure rate than Jadeveon Clowney. So he would be a ability to add some additional juice more to the pass rush than as a run stuffer. So Jadeveon Clowney, just picture this. Jadeveon Clowney maybe starts the season as a Micah Parsons replacement while he still has lots of gas in the tank at the start of the season. And then as Micah Parsons comes back into the starting lineup for the Packers, then Jadeveon Clowney could be your number 2 or 3 defensive end coming off of the bench. And I think that would be an interesting option. Now, given his pressure rate success, he's probably going to get more than the other players that I've already mentioned so far, probably looking at something like 1 year, $10 million. So I do think the other players I've talked about are better values, but there's no question that Jadeveon Clowney could not significantly help the pass rush for the Packers if he was signed. He is older. He would definitely be a 1 year rental, which is not really something the Packers generally will do, but it's worth considering. Next up on the defensive line, as I said, tackles are definitely on the older edge in free agency. We have David Almanyata of the Atlanta Falcons, PFF grade of over 80, and he's in a situation where he does really good against the run attack. So he would be ideal as a defensive lineman in a 3-4 because he still has the size to take on 2 blockers, which is really what you want out of a nose tackle. So if the Packers did switch to a 3-4, this would be a good short-term rental. You could probably get him for about $4 to $5 million on the top side. And I think he could do well for you on a 1 to 2 year contract. I wouldn't do more than 2 years for a 33-year-old player. In fact, I would argue you just offer him a 1 year contract, take it or leave it, so you don't have to worry about being on his contract when he's 34 or 35. And one of my crushes, and I don't think this would happen, would be John Franklin Myers of the Denver Broncos. He had an amazing season last season. He had 95 total pressures before the AFC Championship game. So that's the whole season plus their first preseason game. He had 95 total pressures. He's a great player for adding pass rush in the middle of the defensive line, but I would argue with Watt, we actually have that player already. Plus, John Franklin Myers was probably going to cost about $15 million a year with a 3 year contract, so 45 total, and I don't think that's within the Packers' budget. And again, I think what they could do probably is restructure Wyatt so they can have him for a couple years and get almost the same production. Because when Wyatt was in there and healthy, he was very effective at generating that interior pass rush. Next up, we have Sebastian Joseph Day of the Tennessee Titans. He's been a good rotational defensive lineman. This is the type of player, again, you could probably get for $4 or $5 million tops and be a rotational defensive lineman and help you try to stop that rushing attack of your opponent. Some other guys to keep in mind, these are lower tier players. We've got Sheldon Rankins, Christian Wilkins, who's still a free agent from the Raiders from last year, which is really a risky proposition because he's had some injury issues with his foot, hasn't really been able to practice for over a year. How useful would he be? And Levi Orazake of the Detroit Lions. I know I butchered that name, but he will also be a free agent. He's kind of a lower tier option. So if you look at the defensive line free agents, generally they're older, but I think there are some players here we can get for relatively cheap on short-term contracts that would help your Green Bay Packers. So one of the challenges that the Packers have is they're short a draft pick for the next couple of years, especially in the first round, where you can get some of those players that the Packers would really need. A starting corner or a nose tackle defensive lineman that's able to stop the run. Those are really first round players. And the Packers don't have those first round picks for the next couple of years because of the Micah Parsons trade. So signing a cheap rental defensive lineman for a couple of years while the Packers wait to be able to restock with the draft, I think makes a lot of sense. So if I could pick one player out of those defensive line players to sign, it would probably be DJ Reader. He would be effective for the Packers both in the 3-4 and the 4-3. You could sign him to a relatively cheap 2-year contract and be fairly comfortable that you're going to get your money out of DJ Reader at this stage in his career. So let's take a look at some linebackers now. Now, if you watched my previous episodes, the salary cap episode in particular, as well as the switch to the 3-4 video, which I did in the past, I advocate the re-signing of Quay Walker if you can get Quay Walker for $8 to $10 million or less. I think if that you're able to get Quay Walker re-signed for that price, then I think he makes a lot of sense for a short 2 to 3 year re-sign for the Packers. So we're going to see what happens there. So linebacker is very challenging. There aren't a lot of great options in the linebacker class for free agency, and the beatniks are saying on the draft predictions that the linebackers are actually a pretty good draft class. I haven't looked at them yet this year. So you might be leaning towards depth at the linebacker position via the late rounds of the draft this year. But if Quay Walker doesn't get signed, you're going to need another inside linebacker. Whether you start in a 3-4 or 4-3, you're still going to have a need for a linebacker. So Leo Chanel of the Kansas City Chiefs is definitely an intriguing target. He's been light on his snaps, but when he's had snaps, he's got an 87 grade from PFF. He's 25. He's a young player that has the ability to also be a effective blitzer. So I think you could look at Chanel at maybe a 2-year, $12 to $14 million contract if you don't re-sign Quay Walker. Now, in my opinion, for that price, probably find a way to get Quay Walker back. But if Quay Walker is asking for more than $10 million, then Chanel could be an option for you. Again, the linebacker market is going to be very thin, especially for what the Packers can afford. So another player that Packers might look at is Bobby Wagner. He's going to be a free agent with the Commanders. He's approaching 36 years old, but he still gets a PFF grade of over 90. If you can have a 1-year opportunity for Bobby Wagner for, say, $7 or $8 million, as a Quay Walker replacement. I think he would be very sufficient for the Packers defense. So Bobby Wagner for 6 to 8 million, if you can't re-sign Quay Walker, would make some sense. Let's take a look at corners now. Now, corners, I think the Packers, regardless of what they do in free agency, are going to hit the corner markets heavy in free agency. I think you're going to see probably a second-round pick being a corner, unless all the good corners are off the board at that point and it's no longer a value. You might see a fourth or fifth round corner as well in this draft to try to really fill up the corner slot with some developmental players. But that being said, the Packers are still going to have to add, I think, at least one or two corners out of the free agency market. Now, they might be targeting middle tier players so they can have some competition in the room between Nixon, Hobbs, Valentine, and some free agents. I don't think you're going to see a superstar, high-powered corner brought in by the Packers in free agency. They're just too expensive for what the Packers have available right now. So let's look at some mid-tier players that the Packers could look at signing. Now, mid-tier corners are still going for a significant amount of money in the free agency market. So it's going to be interesting to see if the Packers can get some value here. Ideally, I think, again, what the Packers would like to do is find a mid-tier veteran that can possibly develop into being a starter over what they currently have, as well as drafting 2 or maybe 3 corners in this draft. So let's take a look at some players that could be relatively inexpensive and still be potential starters for the Packers based on what they currently have on the roster. So we have Jalen Watson of the Kansas City Chiefs, PFF grade of 76.4. Now, important to note that there are no positions on the defense that vary more than cornerback play. A corner can have a great year and a bad year. They can have great stats and they can have bad stats because it depends so much on whether the opponent throws your direction, how successful they are, how well you do in certain passing situations against your opponent one year versus the next. Also, with corners, if you lose your speed, you can quickly go from being a great starter to a problematic starter just by losing a few tenths of a second to your speed. It's really remarkable how much corner production can fluctuate. And that is why a lot of teams, including the Packers, try to find efficient, cost-effective starters for the corners because it varies so much. You want to either develop your own or maybe find a free agent diamond in the rough and end up turning them into a quality starter. So Jalen Watson, he has a 5.8 missed tackle rate, tied for 9th in the league, so he's a good tackler. The Packers really do like their corners that are able to tackle, especially if the running back gets past the first or second level. It's really great to have corners that can actually make solid tackles. So Jalen Watson would definitely fall in that category. We have NFL championship champion Tariq Woolen of the Seattle Seahawks. His career has been up and down. He does fit what the Packers like physically as a corner. He had 8 interceptions and 20 pass breakups, ranking in the 93rd percentile in forced incompletions. So Woolen is a great player on a couple levels because he could probably bring that championship mentality. Since they just won the championship, he could be a leader in the cornerback room given that championship. The challenge is he would probably get about $15 million a year, 3 years for 45, and he would be a very expensive option for the Packers. As we know historically, when you win the Super Bowl and you're a free agent, you're going to probably get a premium for your salary. So Woolen is probably out of the Packers price range, but I wanted to bring him up. We have Asante Samuel of the Steelers. He's definitely on the older side, so there's definitely a lot of risk that he could lose a step. So I think he's an unlikely candidate for the Packers. It really just doesn't fit what they're looking for. Now, one player that really interests me is Rasul Douglas. He's probably going to be in that 15-a-year range, but he's relatively young. He had a PFF grade of 73.6 with the Miami Dolphins, a defense that didn't have a lot of talent to support him. He recorded 10 or more pass breakups and interceptions in 3 of the past 4 seasons. So Rasul Douglas definitely intrigues me, and I think the Packers might be able to sign him as a key free agent. Next up, we have Chidobe Awuzie of the Baltimore Ravens. He is 30 years old, which would be real catch-22 for the Packers. On the one hand, at 30 years old, you could probably get him for a relatively cheap contract, but does he still have the ability to hold with the really good wide receivers in the NFC North? And it's going to be a real catch-22 there, but I would argue that he is a better corner. He would be a starting corner for the Packers if he was on their roster right now. So I think he's worth considering for the Packers, even though he's older. Some other options are Roger McCreary of the Los Angeles Rams, PFF grade of 71.7, and Trayvon Diggs of the Dallas Cowboys / Green Bay Packers, who had a PFF grade of 61. Now, again, anytime we're looking, I would say, past Rasul Douglas on this list, you're probably looking for a veteran for a relatively cheap price that could compete to be your starter. Rasul Douglas, I think, would be a lock to be a starter for the Packers. After that, at corner, the rest of this list is kind of like throw them in, see if they can win the job at starting corner. Let's look at offensive line now. Now, offensive line, I've already advocated several times. It makes sense to re-sign Sean Rhyan as your center for anywhere from $8 to $10 million a year, which is, I think, where his price tag would be. I think Sean Rhyan, you sign him to a 3 or 4 year contract at that price point, and you can have your center for the next 3 to 4 years. Set it and forget it. Sean Rhyan he knows the culture, he knows the coaches, he knows the community, and he was a more than viable. In fact, I would argue he was a pretty good center, especially at the end of the season when the Green Bay Packers were at the end of the year. Sean Rhyan was actually playing pretty well. He wasn't the reason that there was pressure. Most of the pressure was coming from Rasheed Walker's side, actually, if you look at the tape. So I think Sean Rhyan should be re-signed. Now, if the Packers re-sign Sean Rhyan, I think they have enough pieces on their offensive line to be okay with what they have, and then have maybe a small depth signing or maybe rely on rookies for that. But I think the Packers have added enough to the offensive line room over the last couple drafts that I think if they re-sign Sean Rhyan, they don't have to make any major additions at the offensive line position. They can basically use their draft and develop players from the last couple of years and make them a starting offensive line. Now, if Sean Rhyan is not re-signed, there's a couple of players we could look at that I don't think are as useful for the Packers. You can look at Isaac Jaramillo of the Pittsburgh Steelers. He is a guard. So if you're looking for guard depth, you can probably look at adding him. Or if you want to shuffle people around the offensive line, I wouldn't recommend it. We know how that worked last year. Then Isaac Giamalo could be a good option at guard. At center, the best option, I think, on the market is going to be Connor McGovern of the Buffalo Bills. He was 13th among centers, and that's not really that different than Sean Rhyan. So again, I would probably just take Sean Ryan instead. But if Sean Ryan leaves, Connor McGovern could be an option from the Buffalo Bills. He's played both center and guard, so you've got that position versatility there. And I think McGovern would be a relatively low-price offensive line addition. Then we also have Ethan Pollock of the Cleveland Browns. He had a PFF grade of just under 69. Again, I'd rather have Sean Ryan, so that's something to keep in mind. So the next biggest issue that I think the Packers really need to look at in free agency, if they can find a good option for a relatively cheap price, is the backup quarterback position. We know Malik Willis will not be back with the Packers. So having a quality backup, given Jordan Love's tendency to miss 2 or 3 games a season, I'm telling you, when Jordan Love makes it through a full season, the Packers are going to the Super Bowl. Because I feel like that's one thing that does hold them back at the quarterback position, is the fact that Jordan Love does tend to get nicked up and miss a game or 2 every year. And that might be the difference between getting home field advantage. So if Jordan Love plays a whole season, I think the Packers are going to the Super Bowl. There goes that tangent. So looking at players that they can get in free agency that could actually be viable backups for Jordan Love is very short. We have Marcus Mariota, Washington Commanders. I think he would make a lot of sense if you could get him for a very cheap contract, $5 or $6 million. Marcus Mariota has played with Matt LaFleur before. He understands what Matt LaFleur is trying to do. So I think he would be a good natural choice. He still has some good mobility for the position, even at his age. So Marcus Mariota would be a solid backup. And he should be available in free agency at a relatively low price. We also have Tyler Huntley of the Baltimore Ravens, and he's got a PFF grade of 73. He has a history of coming in as a spot starter. I think Tyler Huntley would be a good bargain option for the Packers. There's also Will Levis of the Tennessee Titans. He will likely be a free agent. And I really think he has the potential to also be a very solid backup for the Green Bay Packers, because we want to have some depth at the quarterback position. The last couple of years, we've thrived by having Malik Willis come in from time to time and have miraculous performances. We need a backup quarterback that can take on those similar opportunities in the event Jordan Love is out for 2 or 3 games. Now, I've said it once and I'll say it again. If Jordan Love misses more than 4 or 5 games, your season's probably over. But you do want to have a quarterback that could try to keep you afloat for 2 or 3 games in a season, given Jordan Love's track record. So there's some free agents you can look at. Now, one caveat here is we don't know if all these players are actually going to get on the market. For example, I expect the Packers to already be discussing with Sean Ryan the opportunity of signing a contract before his current contract is up. Technically, you have until March to re-sign your players if you choose to do so. So it would make sense for the Packers to take Sean Ryan, lock him up to a long extension before he hits free agency. I think that makes a lot of sense, and I'm sure the Packers are already exploring that option. But every team in the NFL is also looking at their potential free agents and doing the same thing. So not all of the players on this list are going to be available at the start of free agency, but that gives you some names to start researching and thinking about for free agency that is coming up before we know it. In just over a month, we'll be in free agency. So hopefully the Packers can find 1 or 2 players. Again, if the Packers can re-sign Quay Walker and or Sean Ryan, I think that really takes 2 of their biggest needs off the table for the Packers before the start of free agency. And I would really encourage them to look at doing that. That's it for this edition of the Pack Attack Cast. We will see you with another edition soon. We're gonna probably have a news and notes edition before the end of the week. Talk about some of the coach signings that the Packers have made this week, as well as some general news and notes, just to wrap up some of the interesting topics of the week. So we'll be back for that probably tomorrow. See you then. As always, go Pack Go.